You know, we are living in an unprecedented time, a moment where the confusion and the disorder in our world reaches everywhere. And it's in this time that our story is being written. And we've been talking about story. We've been talking about your story, our story, and we're going to be talking about his story. But just think about your story. We've talked about that. Where does it begin? Your story begins with your name. It's just packed full of so much history. It's packed full of your parents thinking about you and your life forward. And so your story begins with your name. My name, Chad. Just Chad. You know where that story came from. Yeah. And each and every one of us, our lives and our story is handcrafted by God through generations. I'm not a pastor here just because I thought I would be one at an early age, but I was a pastor because of things that were happening generations before me, and with my mom and my grandparents. And so our story is being shaped, by those generations. And today, our story all leads us here, doesn't it? To this place. So that your story, every one of your stories, is really a part of our story. The story of Spirit of Life. And today we want to talk about our story. The story of us together. And this story is very much like the one that Galen just read about in 2 Kings chapter 4. It's a story of a widow. And it's a dramatic story, and it's a hard story. It's a story of desperation. A faithful woman has lost her husband. He died. And he was a member of the followers of Elisha. They call them the company of the prophet. In other words, they traveled with Elisha. They were trained by Elisha. They were discipled by him. And so they were a part of this special, I would call it kind of a church. And her husband passed away, and now she was a single mom with 2 very young kids. Had a mountain of debt that she couldn't pay, and the creditors were coming after her because she had nothing. In that day and time, the creditor could take her children. So she goes to the prophet Elisha, and she says, we are faithful people. My husband was one of the company of the prophets. And right now, I'm in this desperate situation because the debtors are going to come and take my children. And there's kind of this idea that you would think that some righteous anger would well up inside of the prophet. And he says, I'm going to be sending a legion of angels that will swoop down and scare this debt collector to death. And he is not going to take your children. But the surprising thing is that the prophet said, well, what do you have in your house? What do you have in your house? And this woman is so desperate, and she's probably sold everything sellable that she's had in the house. She says, I only have one thing in my house. I have this small bottle of oil. You probably have a small bottle of oil too. Maybe in your house. Small bottle of oil. That's all she has. And so the prophet says, you go out and you find every jar that you can find. Borrow it from your neighbors. Find some that have been discarded. I don't care what kind of condition it is. You find every container that you can pour oil into, and you bring them to your house. I could just imagine those 2 little boys are scurrying around the whole town looking for containers for oil, and they bring all of those jars back into their house. And the prophet says, and now you go inside of there and you shut the door. You shut the door, you and the boys, and you take this small jar of oil and you just start pouring it inside those containers. Logic tells us this is not really going to go too far, right? But as she poured, and I can just visualize two young kids just right there staring at every bubble in the little jar. This little jar. They could just see them watching this oil pouring into this container. And she poured, and the first container was full. And they pulled another jar over, and this little jar just kept pouring out oil. Jar after jar after jar. Can you imagine these kids? What they are learning, what they are understanding about a God who just multiplies stuff. You know, he's always doing that in the Bible, isn't he? Multiplying stuff. And she pours until every jar that she has in the house is full. The little jar is filling up all the big jars. And as she gets to the last one, she says to one of their kids, says, bring me another jar. Let's keep this going. Bring me another jar. And finally they get to the place where all of the jars are totally full. There is no other jar to be had. And when they're all full, the little jar stops pouring. And she goes and she tells the prophet about this great miracle. Her house that didn't have anything but this small jar of oil is now filled with a supply of oil. Something that's valuable, something that's sellable. And Elisha says, you go take the oil that's in your house and you sell it. And you pay off your debt. And she did. And Elisha said, and you can now live on what was left over. That was her story. So what does this mean? What's this story trying to tell us about? This story is really telling us about people. The jars are people. This is a way that the Bible is telling us that we live in a time where there are so many people that are walking around and they're so busy and they have so much stuff going on, but they are empty jars. They're empty on the inside. They have a lot of things to do. They're accomplishing a lot of stuff. They're doing many things, accumulating many things, but inside they're empty. They're running on empty, and many people have just totally been used up. And that there's nothing inside of them, and they feel like they have no value, no hope, and no purpose. And right now, in this post-pandemic time, the emptiness in people has never been more intense. And what God is calling churches to do and Christians to do, to realize this is a time to step up. This is a time to understand that our calling is to help fill people with things that are worth having inside. To fill people up with words of life, with promises of God, with care, and helping people understand the future that God has for them. The time has never been more dire for this. And I know you feel it in the people that you know. the people that you see. And the big question is going to be, what are we going to do in this time? What are we going to do with all the empty vessels? I remember about a year ago, from time to time, I would pick up Riley from preschool. And my granddaughter, I'd come swing in and I'd pick her up from school, and she would be ready to talk. And you know Riley, she is talkative. And I remember that day, she got in the car and she says, Paul, I'm going to be a bucket filler. A what? A bucket filler. I'm going to be a bucket filler. I don't know. Do you know what a bucket filler is? I mean, like, what is a bucket filler? And he says that everybody's like a bucket. And I want to be a bucket filler so that I'm putting good things into their buckets. I'm going to be their friend. I'm going to help them. I'm going to say kind words. And every time I do it, I'm filling the bucket. And I want to fill it up for people and put good things that God wants me to put in their bucket. Because also in the class, she learned that there was another kind of person, not a bucket filler, but a bucket dipper. I'm learning all this cultural stuff, from my preschooler. People who are bucket dippers, what do? Well, they're constantly dipping into your bucket and they're taking things out. They're taking those valuable things away. And what bucket dippers do is they take all those good things that are going on and it leaves them at a place where they are empty. Wow. They're learning this in preschool? When we think about your story, and as we think about here, our story together, this is a time when our world needs bucket fillers, right? We really need bucket fillers. People that look at others and see the emptiness, that realize that there is a critical need that people have right now at this moment. And if you listen to the news media and a lot of the talking heads, and they tell you the critical issue of our time is racism, it's injustice, it's crime, it's global warming, it's immigration issues. That's not the critical issues of our time. That is not the critical issue of our time. The critical issue of our time is emptiness. It's emptiness. It's disconnection from God, because disconnection from God leads us to be disconnected with others. It puts us in that bucket dipper category, because if someone doesn't agree with us, we're angry at them. And if they're not cooperating with us, we blame them. And when things get worse, people try to find some ways to project their unhappiness. And this is a time right now where all of those things are doing nothing but hurting us as a culture, as a people. And we think solving some of these so-called crisis things are going to make a difference. They're going to make it worse. Going to make it worse. Because the critical need that we have, it's emptiness. It's a thing that's isolating us. It's a thing that's polarizing us. It's the kind of stuff that's just fueling the anger and the blame. And this story about this widow tells us something. We have everything we need to fill the emptiness around us. You might, we're just a little church. Well, doesn't the story really take care of that? The only thing that the widow had was this one teeny, weeny, small jar of oil. And that oil filled all the emptiness, all of the jars. I'm just imagining the jars they scrounged up. I bet there were broken pots, cracked pots, pots that were nasty. I mean, can you imagine the kind of pots that these kids went out and just borrowed, begged, and found and brought home? But these pots still, they were empty. And when the oil was poured into them, they became valuable. You know, our story is about empty buckets too, isn't it? I mean, there have been days in our lives when we felt like an empty bucket. And that emptiness was crushing us. That we just felt maybe that we were unloved, disregarded, abandoned. And you know, we needed somebody to be a bucket filler for us and to notice our bucket and fill our bucket. And that's what we need to do. This is a time where our church and churches everywhere need to rise up and say, I want to be a bucket filler, right? I want to be a bucket filler. To decide to be a bucket filler. And that is to come alongside of those people that we are encountering. And we can sense the need and the struggle and the loneliness that's inside of them. And this is a time for the church to kind of get out of this, we're just taking care of our own people mode. We're just programming just for us. But to be thinking about the emptiness around us where we can fill buckets. Buckets of people that will bring them life and new perspective. And you know, that's just kind of risky, right? This is the kind of stuff that has so many unknowns. You don't know if it's going to work. You don't know how it's going to unfold. But you know, we can seize the day and say today, regardless of what will happen, regardless how that person will respond, I'm going to be a bucket filler. I'm going to fill a bucket today. And that we believe that the stuff that goes into them through our words and our care and what we do, that those things will make a difference in their lives. And for us maybe to have the courage to stand next to them and help them. I don't know, you guys kind of know Galen's story, right? You know, Galen went off from his home here for a while, and he came back, and he was pretty empty. Some of you saw that. Some of you kind of know that. Like, what am I going to do? What's next? And you know, we had an opening in our praise band for a drummer. We needed a drummer. And Galen volunteered to be the drummer. You know, and you're just thinking like, uh-oh. Galen wants to be the drummer. He just volunteered. But you know, really what was going on, he was just asking for another chance. We've got to understand that. That people, when they're empty, what they're looking for is another chance. Another chance. And I want to tell you that the days and the months and the years after that, you guys have been his bucket filler. A lot of moments and a lot of times and a lot of affirmation. His jar was filled. And today we're so proud he's one of our pastors in our church. You know, in our church, we have the potential to fill a lot of jars. Did you see these kids up here? Engaged. I put together a little bag where I have things I'm going to illustrate the children's message for. And I almost have to fight them off with a fly swatter to get them to leave the bag alone. What's in that bag? Can I have it? Can I have it? They don't even know what's in there. But how many of those kids are going to go through those times where they hit the emptiness bump? Or they're thinking about what to do in their lives. And they're a part of a church where we have an opportunity to be bucket fillers each and every day. Every children's message is bucket filling. That's what it is. Putting those good things in there, and if they don't understand all the words, they understood that there was a time for them where they were the focus of attention and care in a place where they are loved. We have people that are empty. And our story here and our calling is that we become a church, and we become people, and we are a church that does these things. But our message to people ought to be sensitive to their emptiness. It ought to be sensitive to them wanting another chance. It ought to be sensitive to them and their need for grace, love, and acceptance of hope and a future. And one person's life that's filled, one person's life can touch thousands, The story about the widow, did you notice how the kids, those two kids, are central in that? Can you imagine these kids watching all those jars filled up? Can you imagine those kids saying, well, the prophet said to just do this? For those kids saying, God's doing something right here. Did you notice that they went in the house and they shut the doors? Why did the prophet say, go in the house and shut the doors? This was a miracle for those three to sit there. That family was changed forever that day when the jars got filled. They paid their debts, and they had enough to live on, and they knew they had a God that was going to take care of them and was going to love them, and a God who could fill them up no matter what. I'll tell you what, kids are watching, right? Kids are watching. Kids are watching our church, who we are, what we do. And I just love the mother just sitting there, just pouring out of that jar, pouring and pouring. It says, go get another jar. Go get another jar. And these kids saying like, there are no other jars. Go find me another jar. And just, there are no other jars. And finally, when every jar is filled, the oil stops. And so what that means to us is that God has enough to fill up every corner, every place in our lives, to fill us up until we're all full. And He won't stop until we're full. One of the greatest tragedies is that people come to church and they get a little filling, so they feel a little bit stronger, and they just go out and, now I can handle it. I just needed a little charge. I just needed, 20% of my battery charge. I can take it from here, God. And what they find out is that they don't get refilled, refueled, recharged. Because that is something that you have to be connected with God to. And He fills us and He charges us. This is a calling that God has given us. And this is the calling of this moment in our culture and in our time. This is the story of Spirit of Life, what we're being called for. And there are many jugs and jars. The potential for filling them is great in this place. And you've been seeing it. You've seen it. You know it. And you know, this is all about one story that we haven't talked about yet, and that's next week, and that's his story. Your story, our story, and his story. So today, what do you want to be? I don't know. I want to be a bucket filler, right? What about you? Do you want to be a bucket filler? Yeah, that's right. That's what we want to be about as a church. Bucket fillers. And guess what? You can do this. You can do this. Because out of what you have, God will accomplish what needs to be done. Think about that. That's the wisdom and that's the insight of the prophet Elisha. He didn't say, man, we're going to send a miracle your way and have legions of it. You know, he didn't do that. He said, what do you have? I want you to ask yourself today, what do you have? What do you have? What has God filled you with? The grace that he's put inside of you. The hope that he's planted inside of you. The stuff you've been through. You know some stuff because you've seen some stuff and you've been through some stuff. The ways that you have been filled in those places that are solid inside of you, you got enough to fill all the people around you that God is going to bring in your life. And our church has enough to fill all the needs that God is going to bring to us. And today the message is, you can be a bucket filler. And you can do it. And I want to challenge you here today to, in your heart today, in these next couple of moments, I want to challenge you to make a commitment to become a bucket filler, a part of our story together in what God is doing right here in this place.